How can God be good when his law includes slavery? How can God be good when his law includes the death penalty for issues that don't seem like that big of a deal? This is the fifth video in our series on Bible difficulties. Let's jump into it, starting with slavery. We all understand that slavery is wrong, but slavery was all over in Bible times, and the Bible never outright condemns all forms of slavery. In fact, it even includes certain rules for how to properly own slaves. The topic of slavery in the Bible has always been interesting to me because so many teens and young adults will tell you that morality changes over time with the current norms of society. If that's the case, why worry about slavery in the Bible? It was a norm of society. But I understand that's not everyone, and it's not a viewpoint you're going to find in the Bible either. So yeah, let's look at it. If you've ever looked up this topic before to hear from a Christian thinker, you've probably heard over and over again that slavery in Bible times was very different from slavery in modern times. That much is true. We can see that simply by reading some of these regulations for owning slaves in the Bible. Like here in Deuteronomy 15, if any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. Our first observation is that in some cases of slavery, Hebrews would volunteer themselves to other Hebrews. This was a common practice as a way for them to pay off their debts. They didn't have banks where you could take out a loan or a government program for food stamps. And so what do? They volunteered themselves as slaves. Another observation is this: slavery was not tied to racism. Today, when we think of slavery, we often picture those horrible acts where Western nations, thinking themselves superior, kidnapped people from other countries and brought them over to serve as slaves. That kind of act is actually condemned in the Bible, clearly, in Exodus 21:16. So those are two differences. We could keep going, the command for slaves to go free after 6 years, the command to send them off well. From just this one passage, we find that slavery in Bible times was indeed very different from slavery in modern times. But if that's all Christians have to say about slavery in the Bible, I think we're being dishonest with ourselves, because you also have passages like Leviticus 25, which says, "You may purchase male and female slaves from among the nations around you." It talks about slaves as property and even makes a distinction between Hebrew and non-Hebrew slaves. So by giving permission for slavery, is God saying this behavior is fine? Not necessarily. A key to understanding the Old Testament laws in general is found in Matthew 19:8. You have these Jewish rulers thinking that divorce is okay because it was permitted by Moses, who wrote down the laws of God. Jesus says, actually, no. He said, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. What this shows is that the laws of God in the Old Testament were not designed to give this perfect standard of what God deems to be morally acceptable. They were designed to work with the corrupt nature of the people and their culture. So in order to really capture God's heart of the matter, Jesus speaks of morality by looking at the very beginning. Likewise, if we turn back to the beginning of God's story in Genesis, we find that all people are made in God's image. As such, we all have infinite value, dignity, and worth, whether we know it or not. That doesn't work well with the concept of slavery. And so I highly suspect we should think of the slave laws in the Old Testament as similar to how we understand divorce. It was not what God had originally intended. We often say, God should have just outlawed slavery entirely. What happened when we tried that in the southern states in America? It didn't work. It was too ingrained in their culture. Same goes for Bible times. For God to just outlaw slavery would be like ordering a communist nation to become capitalist overnight. It doesn't work like that. And so God regulated slavery. He pushes for these people to be treated fairly as real human beings. That shift in direction was to lead us to the point where eventually Christian leaders would think differently about slaves and put an end to it. We even see that starting to surface in the New Testament. You still have some, people, some regulations to treat slaves like human beings, but you also see this letter to Philemon, where Paul tells him to welcome back a runaway slave and to receive him as a slave no longer, but as a fellow brother in Christ. Okay, let's shift and talk about the death penalty in God's law. Whether or not you think the death penalty is generally appropriate, you'd probably take issue with some of the violations which call for death in the Bible. You see the death penalty for things like being a sorceress, having sexual intercourse with an animal, cheating sexually on your spouse, touching holy objects when you're not supposed to, or even working on the Sabbath. Death for working on the Sabbath. What? 2 points on this. Okay, first, many Old Testament professors have argued that the strict punishments in the law of God were not always to be taken as literally as we think. We are used to Western state laws, which is very strict. You go by the book. But the idea of God's law comes from the Hebrew word Torah. We often translate Torah into the word law, but probably a better translation would be instruction or teaching. Old Testament professor John Goldingay points out, when a king lays down a set of statutes, it doesn't mean they become the basis of legal practice. They are rather a collection of indications of the kind of moral and social norms that the king claims to be committed to. The Old Testament operates on a parallel basis. Laws that prescribe execution for murder, adultery, idolatry, and a long list of other acts are markers of the kind of religious, moral, and social commitments that God expects his people to accept. They are indications of how serious these offenses are. I think Goldingay does a good job showing that the Torah of God is not as strict as we assume. Still, we see examples where the death penalty really happened under Jewish leadership. Just ask Jesus. Second point, there are about 15 times you see the death penalty show up in the law. One time, however, the requirement for the death penalty adds an additional detail that may shed new light on all of the others. In the case of premeditated murder, the penalty is death, but the law also says that the guilty person cannot substitute his death sentence with a ransom or a fine. So, apparently, ransom substitutes were a thing with death penalties. You'd pay the fine rather than get killed. If that was the case, it would certainly have been the norm. Ultimately, the issue of the death penalty may come back to some of the things we discussed about judgment earlier in this video series, but hopefully that was helpful. The next video of this series will be about the serious moral failures of these people like David and Samson in the Bible, who are often treated like heroes of the faith. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.